Special thanks to my, what do we call it, Final Project Committee, my advisor Mark Applebaum, the chair of the committee, Brian Ferniho, Eric Ullman as third reader, and second third reader all the way from Japan, Yaroslav Kapuscinski. Well, for those of, do I not know anyone? Anyway, I'm Michael Berger. Hi. I'm fifth year in the composition DMA program here at Stanford. And instead of spending time reading my bio, I'm going to introduce myself by playing some of my past works that I've completed while at school here. All of them, though, I chose them with a mind towards describing the conditions of my final project piece called That Is Only a Mirror, which we'll get to in a minute. Oh, I already started my stuff. Let's see. Generally speaking, in all of my work, I've been very interested in the juxtaposition between musical sensation with the structures and shapes that it creates in the mind when one experiences these sensations, particularly dispersed in time. I'm fascinated by the comparison of musical surface with deeper structure, particularly with materials and structures that do not necessarily reinforce one another. To clarify, I am less interested in the newness of musical materials themselves, and more interested in the particularity of their recombination and the associative metaphorical weight that their recombination might bring. The samples I'm about to play for you each focus on issues or display surface characteristics that are crucially important to my final project piece. First, I'm going to start, get the least out of the way, is a little exercise that I did for a class a few years ago, less of a piece. But it demonstrates this juxtaposition of, as I say, materials and structures that don't necessarily reinforce one another. It's an exercise, it's a tape exercise involving recordings of insects and birds tweeting the way we're used to hearing them as background noise. But I chopped them up in a particular way that ideally, and I can't account for my own skill here, because I think there are a few bits you hear it, but ideally you don't hear the breaks, you just hear that the structure of this otherwise naturally occurring phenomena is altered, and it produces a kind of a dissonant experience that I find to be interesting. Let's see here. Kind of strophe that's created by that bird tweeting and there's a thud happening that sort of punctuates the repetition where the bugs are a less obvious thing. Yes, let me cue up my next thing. So, though I've not always described this interest of mine in these specific terms, I've always vaguely been moving in this thematic direction. In 2008, I composed a work that, in a different way, was set directly to confront the same issue, or at least it was intended to elicit a similar mode of listening. The mode of listening in particular, which continues to be of interest to me and is relevant for the final project piece. Skeleton, from 2008, seeks to focus the listener's attention on a series of moments onto the surface of these moments. It then asks the listener to compare what he or she is hearing in the present to what he or she has heard in the past, and to draw his or her own meaning from the experience. It asks them to forego attention to potential phrase structure and other middle ground concerns. These demands are a little awkward in practice, since I have to verbally ask you to listen in that way to begin with, and don't accurately reflect my current outlook on the matter precisely. But the similarity between the listening experience here and with certain sections of my final project piece is striking. So I've included an excerpt here, the first 5 minutes. have become interested in the potential for static musical objects or procedures to produce vivid and unpredictable results, like a mobile with fixed physicality blowing unpredictably in a breeze, and so then to reveal itself. Grammar aside. Or like a Platonic metaphor of shadows on a cave wall, the surface of what is heard in a piece of music composed with these considerations in mind is a flattened representation of the metaphorical physicality of its guiding compositional procedures. In 2009, I composed a set of 7 gestures, each meant to embody a particular physicality or energy type. I will play you 2 of them right now. Before I play the second of the 2 of the 7 gestures, I'd like to clarify what I mean by a physicality of an object, of a musical object. In this case, the mobile metaphor is, I feel, fairly appropriate. In the piece, there's one chord that's articulated by all of the instruments at the very end, but that rotates in sort of each in its own steady fashion from a broken form into a fixed form towards the end. So it's really a matter of physical necessity that the thing will come together in the end. But I still find the emergent properties of those particular notes being treated in that way to be sparkly fresh, is an unacademic way to put it. There's unpredictable harmonic implications depending on how the different notes are offset against each other, and the timbral interest is I hadn't predicted when I set out to compose the piece. The next one I want to play is called eupnea, which is regular breathing, and the following one's called hullabaloo, and with or without a Christopher Walken accent. Let's see. That piece, Hullabaloo, was actually an answer of mine to an earlier piece that I wrote the year before for a collaborative film and composition project here. Is it always called Interval 100, or just that one time it was called Interval 100? It was called Interval 100. The piece itself that I wrote was called Meanwhile, and it was in Meanwhile that I discovered or thought of what I consider to be a beautiful compositional device that essentially consists of specifically notated music that is slightly out of time. It's not in meter at any rate. So with every performance, the performers vary what the result is, and you get something just vaguely similar and vaguely different all at the same time, every time, even when the performers are intending to replicate past performance. In this case, in Hullabaloo, I have a series of sections of repeat signs that vary in size towards the end of the piece, where they're increasing in size, and at the end they've increased so much that it's really just a sustained pitch that's broken, which is sort of me being facetious. It's because it's also a very small chunk of time. But this initially happened in Meanwhile, and I actually think it's a little more effective in that piece. And since it's so short, being only 100 seconds, I'd like to play that one for you now as well. So it's important to, I guess, focus on the couple of points that came out of these last several pieces. That is the importance to me of sort of a metaphorical physicality in any system I employ, or in any system I employ that I want to serve that end. But what is more important is how that's separate from the regular use of a system. I think it's different only from how someone else may just use a system offhand, in that it is focused on itself. It's self-awaredly a system. It's treated by me to be robust and holy, almost, so that something that is produced by this system is emblematic of the system itself and needs to be treated accordingly. It doesn't mean that I will accept everything that comes out of such a system, but it means that there's a particular thematic weight that I give such things intentionally. Another important thing that comes out of those last pieces is the experience of any moment in time being vaguely familiar, or definitely familiar, but also vaguely different simultaneously. It's I call it a sort of fuzzy frustration that, at least in my experience, causes me to question the substance of my own experience. I wonder if I heard it correctly to begin with, and I hear that there's a repetition, and I seek to find the boundary of the repetition. And in the last piece particularly, there are no boundaries. Or there are written on the page, but the material glides across the boundaries. So this concludes the introductory portion of my talk, and brings us to my recently premiered final project piece, That Is Only a Mirror. Again, I am concerned primarily with the juxtaposition of a fixed system, a fixed physicality, an objective reality, if you will, with freedom and spark of life of the present moment, of an unpredictable force or of an agent, a being in the present. In addition to an interest in the experience of these sorts of sounds, as was the case with the previous examples, That Is Only a Mirror is narratively and thematically driven by the exploration of this comparison. The title that is only a mirror, is taken from a passage in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. The phrase is spoken by Gimli the dwarf in response to the suggestion that, quote, the least reward he shall receive is that his memory shall remain ever clear and unstained in his heart, and shall neither fade nor grow stale. Memory is not what the heart desires, Gimli responds. That is only a mirror. Be it as clear as Khaled Zaram, which, as the nerdier among us will of course know, Khaled Zaram is a fictional lake that is notable for the penetrating clearness of its reflective surface. There is a contrast and a comparison set up by this exchange by the two characters. Gimli is saying that no matter how clear and available the past is to a being in the present, that the past and the present are fundamentally separate, in the same way that one's reflection in a mirror, no matter how clean the mirror is disembodied from oneself. The piece seeks to take this philosophical contrast, this ontological ambiguity, as I shall put it, and imbues it to every level of its own construction, into every phase of the compositional process, and with its presentation, it enables an experience of the present for the listener that is self-awarely colored and shaped by his or her memory of the past. And I'd like to play it for you before I talk about it anymore. You'll find the score in your packets, as everyone knows, or seems to know, in the wrestling. piece is primarily made of two types of material, generative and reflective. It is easy enough to imagine I can present one musical object and then repeat or superimpose it the same or differently. But it becomes increasingly difficult to say which is which, whether it is an object or a reflection, when we are not able to assign the primacy of identity to one version or the other, either because the time order in which the objects are presented is uncertain, or there are so many reflections, and all happening fragmentedly at different angles with no clear pattern, that one cannot keep track. Both of these are true of this piece. I'm going to now talk a little bit about the surface of the piece before going on to a discussion of the construction. And we're first going to have a look at one of the most basic operations in the piece. Primarily, the piano is the only instrument in the ensemble who ever is allowed to play new material, who's ever given new material to play. The ensemble is always acting in response to this. The ensemble gets its material only from the content of the piano solo at the beginning, and then is reinvigorated again by the second piano solo towards the end. So we're going to keep track of one particular figure, and that is on figure 1 of your handout on page 29. And I'm just going to play it quickly on the piano so you get an isolated hearing of it. It's essentially, let me see here. So, it is essentially this. That last note was a D that we'll come back to for the discussion a little bit later. But the primary concern here are the A flat B flat rising figure and the A B underneath it rising figure. And in figure 1 you'll see a version of the score from rehearsal letter B through D that outlines, or actually I've removed all of the pitches and musical content that isn't a reflection of that figure from the piano, which happens in measure 11 of the opening piano solo, which is on 7 or 8 and 9, I believe, of your packet. 7 through 8, yes. And again in measure 14 in a slightly different version, and again in measure 24, and then again in another version. So the figure, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the trouble here, as I've just explained, that it came from the piano solo, but even within the piano solo, there's no clear origin for this figure. We could say that it's the measure 11 instance because it happens first, but it's not emphasized in measure 11. It's emphasized in measure 14 as the second part of a downbeat figure that opens with a rest in rehearsal A. And then again, that might not even be said to be the prime version of it because it comes back later in with fuller context in measure 24. But it really depends on how we define what makes this object have identity. And so the problem here is that it both comes from a place, but it's coming from an uncertain place. Let me see, blah, blah, blah. So I'm curious, I'm not sure about time, but I would like to listen to a section of the piece again where this figure outlines, and just try to follow this version of the score and see if we can pick out any of these reflections of the figure. I'll play 1 or 2 minutes. That's B. Fade it out and talk over it a little bit. I should mention again the importance of the D that I mentioned at the end of the figure, which is, if you're following in this version of the score, they've all been omitted, but in the original score, they frequently appear where they should as part of this reflection. And as early as rehearsal B and continuing through all the way until the entrance of the piano at D, at rehearsal D rather, this also happens to be on a D. So this recurring phrase, though it's submerged in the texture of the piece, is important for sort of subliminally establishing the expectation for this new arrival point. The second piano solo is itself a reflection of the first piano solo, although in this case it's not reflecting any of the materials from the first solo. It's more of a conceptual reflection. It's the first other new thing. It's the complement to the first solo. And there's lots of cliches for complementary things that I won't go into. But what I would like to do is jump ahead, because I'm behind. Let's see here. I could refer you very quickly to figure 2 on the following page, which actually is, it's not a list of all the things I'll go through in this talk, but it is essentially the worksheet from which I drew the excerpts from the opening piano solo. I scanned through the solo to find material that I thought was the most salient and had the most weight, and excerpted it onto a worksheet like this, where I then took it as wrote and used that as source material for the rest of the ensemble parts. Fade you out. So, where am I? I've already been speaking a little towards this, but the form of the piece is relatively simple, and in figure 3 I've included a diagram of where that comes from. It's essentially, you don't need to know the particulars of the rhythm set A that's described in the top right, but essentially that's a set of rhythmic proportions that sort of permeates the piece. There are 2 sorts of rhythm that are derived through a series of steps that I won't go into at the moment, that are the fundamental building blocks of the rhythm in the piece. And so here, rhythm set A in its most basic form is, I'm showing it as the basis for not only the global form of the work, where most of the important rehearsal marks happen, and then the shifts in texture and thematic function, but also nested within that, the piano form for the first and second solo are divvied up in the same way, same set of proportions. At the very bottom of the figure, there's the fancy, pretty dumbed-down version of the form, which is essentially a little bar graph. The fading out of the bars indicates less a dynamic decrease or increase, but a fragmentation. So the piano solo, the second piano solo rather, fades away into E, and from measure 105 in the score on to E, it's recycling its own material. It's lost its primacy of identity, its drive to create, and it's searching among its leftovers, really, to continue on. And meanwhile, the ensemble is assembling itself out of the same pile of stuff. Oh, let me see here. I think we're at a good point now where I should start talking about the construction of the work. The compositional process for me is primarily driven by my interest in thematically exploring the implications of the piece's founding metaphor. The basic dichotomy of the mere metaphor is between authenticity and inauthenticity. I'm very curious about this distinction, about how irreconcilably problematic it is, and what conceptual space might exist between the two if they are treated as poles on a spectrum. Because I'm picky about which particular can or cans of worms I'd like to open with this discussion, I'm going to reframe the dichotomy as being between objective reality, though hypothetical, and subjective reality, though unverifiable. Reality and its experience. Further, I'd like to propose two perspectives of this dichotomy, each from one of the two poles in the dichotomy. From the objective perspective, the singular immutability of objective reality is preferable to the fluid arbitrariness of subjective reality. The subjective perspective, inversely, preferences the fixed perdurance of subjective freedom of identity, of the being through time, in time, over the ubiquitous yet hazy remoteness of objective reality. This sort of presents a paradoxical relationship, but this relationship's at the heart of how I approach the construction of the piece. At each stage of my compositional process, I identified which of these two perspectives I was taking up, or likely to be taking up, and then I steadfastly attempted to keep myself at or near one of the two poles, in sort of checking my decisions back and forth. So for instance, in figure 4, which is a very big figure that if you are curious you can go over at your own leisure. I will not read it to you, unfortunately. But this goes over the sort of back and forth of the process of composing pretty much the entire work. And I'll go over as an example just the first column. The piece began with a vague idea of a kind of texture, of the metaphor that I wanted to explore, but I didn't have any strong compulsion towards any particular material with which to forward that narrative. So what I did have a strong compulsion towards was breaking up the 10 instrumentalists, or the 10 instruments in the ensemble that I had, into individual shards of the ensemble, into shapes that could be reconfigured and moved around as the piece progressed. And while that sort of orchestrational technique didn't shake down through the entire process and end up being an important part of the piece, it was still very important to the initial derivation of material that I took. So what happens in this chart is I created these subsets of the ensemble. There were 26 of them. And that is purely a subjective decision. But then and this is really not very sleight of hand move, I say these are fixed. These are examples of things that are of a fixed physicality that I cannot change. What I can do, though, is try to find the logic behind, or what logic might be behind, this object if it's a fixed thing. So in the subjective column in stage 2, Roman numeral 2, I have developed a simple instrument space that arranges the 10 available instruments very roughly by tone color similarity. And this is really rough. I'm well aware that the implications of saying I arranged the instrument space by timbre are far outside the bound or the scope of my talk, and I didn't really stick to them either. There was a very simple pseudo-scientific method where I surveyed myself and one other person and arranged an instrument space that, if you're curious, we're going to get to in figure 5. But what this essentially gave me is a fixed space. As you see again, I take that space and treat it as physical, and I put into this space those configurations that I designed arbitrarily before. So if we look then to figure 5, you'll see one example of this. There's an ensemble of oboe, trombone, and percussion that forms a triangle in this circular space. And if you look below, you can see that I can transpose that triangle by rotating it in the space to another configuration, this time of clarinet, viola, and trumpet. And I identified the corresponding pitches that result out of this spacey way of thinking, that doesn't work, on the side there, which I'll get to in the next figure, actually. But for now, it's suffice to say that I identify this kind of triangle as type A. It has a dotted line, which is its minor form, which is kind of like an inversion. Don't need to go into those details. And it's in the first transposition as opposed to the 0th transposition. So it's A1 capital M. And below, it's A4 capital M through a simple rotation. So, I'm going to go back to this very quickly. By looking at those sub-ensembles, subsets of the ensemble that I took as being primal, inside of this space, I could eke out and derive a set of relationships between those subsets. For instance, in figure 5, that's, you could say, a transposition of a third up, from 1 to 4. And I took those as being sort of emblematic of this fixed system, and so then also emblematic and then fixed. And they became the source of rhythmic material. So that A type of rhythm that we see in an earlier figure is actually derived from the relationships that come out of placing these instruments in this system. The next step that I take, well, now we'll leave figure 4 because it's just going to trip me. But in figure 6, we get to the answer to a question that I begged a little bit earlier by saying that this instrument space led to a chord of pitches. There's no one-to-one relationship between some instrument space that I made up out of nowhere and some pitch space that I not necessarily made up from nowhere, but can appeal to different arrangements of pitches to form different spatial relationships for understanding relationships. Blah, long sentence. So what I did is I actually had a friend of mine, Hong Shan, who is here. Where is he? He's here. Doesn't matter. Hi! He wrote me a little program that is essentially a calculator for me that you see screenshots from in figure 6. And what it is a physical simulator. I predetermined ahead of time, arbitrarily again, that I wanted a certain likelihood of, say, pitch class C to appear in the final piece. There would be a 90% chance of this happening versus a 5% chance of a B natural happening of any octave. So these big circles on the bottom of each of these screenshots represent the gravitational attraction of these different pitch classes. And the dots at the top in the first screenshot are the positions of the instruments around this instrument space. So what I do is I simply input those instrument values into the system and I allow it to go, and you'll see in the second screenshot they are falling. Right, I'll tell you, they are falling. And they're being pulled side to side in different directions depending on the relative pull of gravity that they feel within this physical calculator. On the next page, flipped over, the balls have hit the ground on the side, and you can see from the row of, by comparing the row of numbers on the left side of this screenshot to those on the right, that they have changed. And what essentially happened here is that I've met the conditions that I set out for myself to convert configurations in instrument space to configurations in pitch space of pitches. So the trio of it was trumpet, oboe, and percussion becomes that chord. They're essentially the same thing. They're different perspectives on the same object, which is this physical logic that drives the system. At the bottom of that page, on page 38, you'll see a graph measuring the difference intensity felt by all of the different objects as they fall as I increase the overall downward pull of gravity. So what happens then, on the far left, you get positions that are completely unaffected by the gravities or the particular gravities of the objects below, the pitch classes. And on the far right, you get positions that reflect objects that are maximally controlled by that pull of gravity. So an example of how this manifests in the piece is just on the next page, 39. We have a quintuplet of instruments, trombone, cello, percussion, piano, and flute, that translate in with just straight across in, so these in with the volume turned down on this graph on the previous page, to this pentachord you see right next to that circle with dots. But if we input those positions into the system, following through with that graph, we get a series of 7 chords. So we can ignore the first stave there, A1, 1, 2, 4, 5, 8, and pay attention to B7M instead, which is the pitches that come out of dropping those instrument space positions through this physical system and outputting them as a series of chords that I think of as increasing intensity as you move from left to right. Below is an example from the end of the opening piano solo where this is really the only example in the piece where they appear 100% unaltered aside from the microtunings being truncated off. But each chord of B7M happens in order in the left hand of the piano, which is kind of interesting. In order to generate the material for the piano, these are my last 2 points, figures 7 and 8, I loaded all the rules that I derived in stages from figure 4. If you go back and go through that in your leisure, you'll see that I derived a set of rules pertaining to pitch, pertaining to harmony, pertaining to rhythm. I gave all of those rules to a patch that I wrote in software called Open Music that essentially functions as another calculator, where I give it some parameters. I say, here's your pitch range, here's the likelihood that you will play a single note versus multiple notes, and here's how long I want you to go. Generate me some material. This is an example of another objective system in this dichotomy of subjective and objective, where I have no say whatsoever in the material that actually comes out of this, but I do have a say in choosing and editing and massaging the material after it comes out. So I went through and generated, I would easily say 100, probably hundreds of little versions of material that were intended to go in the opening piano solo, and then edited them by my own subjective desires to fit together into the solo. And the solo is structured into 3 sorts of material, and they're emblematic of the 2 opposing poles of the metaphor I'm talking about. So there's objective and subjective. For objective material, the piano presents punctuating chordal material, very abrupt and hard. Subjective material is considered to be those sections that are figured or figural, where it seems like shapes of melody or rhythm or just perceptual shapes of sound are emerging out of the texture. And the third, which is very important and ties into how I mentioned there's probabilities in how the material is generated, is that of chaos. The opening growling roll of the piano is chance-based. It represents the chaotic. It's stochastic. I give it bounding conditions and allow for the universe or the player or whatever force that causes it to be, the material to be incepted or conceived, to realize that, I'll use my fun word, desultorily, randomly. And that's the process that contributed to the composition of the opening piano solo. It moves roughly from the chaotic to the objective, through the figural, and then repeats. A similar process was undertaken to generate the materials for the ensemble. After identifying the different excerpts that I would use in repetition, which is figure 2 if you care, I would load those into another open music patch that would stochastically vary the timing of these figures, so that a single pulse entered, say, that. Well, you can see actually in figure 8, there's a figure that's entered that is actually quarter note, rest half note, quarter note, and there are 5 different versions of that. For at each stage of analysis or computation in this patch, it has a random chance that it will randomly vary by some amount. So you get these materials that remain themselves but are stretched in very gloggy ways. I'm just about out of time, so I'd like to, I guess, do 2 things. One would be to reiterate the central metaphor of the piece and how its importance to guiding the composition of the work, and its importance to me in my experience of hearing the presentation of the work. But also to clarify that I don't intend that you necessarily intuitively hear the piece that way either. That it's, at the very least, say if someone doesn't hear any of this whatsoever, I hope that the intention and rigor that I brought into the process of composing it and holding myself to these very strict rules will imbue the piece with a certain hierarchical richness that would allow different interpretations to surface. Yeah, I guess I'd like to open it up for some questions. Yeah, any questions?
Thank you, Michael.
I worried that it disconnected you. Okay.
Are you here?
No, he's there. You have to enter a password. Don't worry.
Okay.
He's there.
He can see us?
Can you see Mark?
Yes, I can.
Whoa. The future.
So if you have the ability to change all of the inputs and context to the system, and then you're allowed to, quote, massage the results, what is the utility of having the system in the first place?
Yeah.
I mean, and it's,
No,
you know, I'm not trying to be an asshole. I just think that
No, that's
how you respond to that could tell us more about you.
no, and that is not a surprising question. Well, I guess the answer is twofold, and I know one of the folds right away, and that is that the poles are so far from one another. The things that I isolated as being objective, generative, as functioning that way, versus things that function subjectively, are so far apart, and I gave enough respect to those results. Like, I could have just said, oh, I don't like any of that, I'll just write something intuitively, and it wouldn't have mattered. And I guess it really comes down to how much did I respect my own systematic guidelines, and I hoped that I did respect them.
Well, then let me change the question. When should you respect them a lot, and when should you respect them a little, and when can you respect them not at all?
I think there's a particular answer for each instance of that in the piece, and I feel cheap by throwing a huge figure 4, see figure 4. I do talk about that in particular because the sorts of things that I keep objective and the sorts of things that I appeal to when making these decisions, there's little tiny arrows between them, which often indicate that I'm bouncing back and forth in order to keep them apart, or to have my subjective decision informed largely by something that's objective, whether it's something I set up, or I guess there are two instances of things I refer to that I didn't make up. I remember the second fold. Wait a minute. Okay. Those two instances are, I often pay particular attention to sort of just good practices with Gestalt grouping. I didn't want to separate things too much or go against any basic grouping rules, because I knew that the result that I wanted needed to have the benefit of the doubt, I guess, so to speak. So I kept it within very basic constraints of perceivability with different materials in order to maybe strongly juxtapose and achieve that state of vagueness that kind of pervades the middle section of the piece, where even though in figure 1, where I outline most of the material, I was surprised in retrospect, is derived from that one piano motive, but it's hidden enough and present enough that it's always, for me at least, vaguely familiar and vaguely dissimilar and fresh, which is that sort of in-between space that I talk about trying to set out to achieve by having these poles at all. So it wouldn't serve my ends at all if I didn't respect the system, because it's by keeping those two poles separate that I hope to try to get at the stuff in between. And the farther apart they are, the more room there is in the middle. Yeah? And I forgot my second fold again. But it's okay.
I have a second question, but I'll let someone else jump in and come back then.
I just want to follow up more specifically on Mark's question, because I was wondering, for instance, about, and this is to refer now to whatever it is, the last page, I guess, of figure 6.
Yes.
Yeah. where you point out how in this one instance the piano literally presents the, as it were, the gravitational shift in the treatment of this one chord.
Yeah.
Yet what's most striking about this is that, of course, the piano is limited to the 12 equal pitches, and the gravitation, and that leaves the last three chords are repetition.
Yeah.
Whereas in the original, there's this subtle but very serious microtonal alteration, which would allow one, I think, to feel some sort of force in some given direction. Maybe this is actually a rephrasing in a way of Mark's question, because it's wondering about what happens to the rigor, not just the rigor, but the intelligibility of the compositional procedures when such a drastic translation needs to be performed in order to incorporate
No, a
it
good
in the
portion
result.
of what seems to be important from that operation is truncated out of the final
Yeah,
result.
because what results then is you have this series of 7 chords, and if you're even identifying them as such, what you're probably going to notice is that 4 have minute differences, and then there's a repetition of 3, or that if you compare the first and last, they share a number of their pitches, and there's maybe a a chromatic descent downward, or
Yeah.
Very, very different kinds of features are going to come to the fore. I was wondering.
Well, in this particular instance, I was aware of that truncation going into it, and I tried to arrange not only the placement formally within the solo to be a point of high tension. I mean, the whole solo is arguably fairly tense. It's not very relaxed. But also, I chose the rhythmic material. I didn't create the rhythmic material, but I chose from a catalog of produced rhythms. And what I chose was within a mind to heightening this increasing tension of this this motion. And I think the particular way that the inner voices and outer voices shift, so let's see, the first happen, I guess, number 4 in the bottom, where we lose a pitch. And then there's, it's emphasized by, first of all, that repetition. It's the only instance that's played twice, rolled, and then we lose further pitches. The same thing is happening in the top voice. I think there's kind of an implied tension. I agree that it's lost, and in this case, potentially a lot is lost, because I listened to the results of these micro-tunings. I built another calculator in order to refer to it in the process. And more than just hearing things get closer together, there was a harmonic intensity that actually, the timbre of that chord together became rougher as it goes through. And that is lost in the end result. But it's kind of, the way I imagine it is, there's an energetic through line moving through space, and it encounters a staircase. And it hits the stair and like pushes up against it until it flops over to the next one, and the same thing happens. And there's a bit of that, ideally, happening here in this one excerpt that brings back a little of what's lost from the truncation, but it's all in the performance of it. It's not just there on the page, as you say. There's repetition.
And it's in the performance because of the physical effort of that.
Yeah,
movement out and back in.
Yeah, and the context and the emphasis that these durations have on the material, because this in the solo, this is the first time where we have any real pause in harmonic motion. It's stopping there, and it's pounding on it. It's just hammering it, and that hammering action, I think, brings with it a lot of the increasing of energy that's lost from the truncated detunings.
Okay, so there's a hope that the other parameters are picking up.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you had to do it again, in what way would you modify the correlation of instrumental groupings and the pitches in your diagram?
Just at the very right down to the fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know. I quite like the arrangement that I ended up with. I think I might, if I were doing it again and I were giving maximum respect to the things I described as being objective, I would have to do a more rigorous investigation into how that space is made up.
Mm.
And it's, first of all, it's obtuse that it's a one-dimensional circle of these instruments. I'm throwing out so much information in order to get them there. But what I like about the resulting circle is that it still feels to me to work. It feels like the instruments are similar enough in that arrangement that it's kind of a bit of a tautology, but in looking at this, you can say, oh, I can see how the trumpet's like the oboe. And then well, let's just not say, I won't put words in your mouth, I'll put words in my mouth. I can see how the trumpet's like the oboe. I can see how the trombone's like the oboe too. I didn't really think of that. And here it's closer. So by looking at this as if it's arbitrarily objective, I'm kind of subliminally sort of corralling the expectation of what is the guiding principle that's arranging them into this, because at once it feels like it makes a little sense. It's very similar to just score order, but there are subtle differences in the arrangement and the proximity of the instruments.
It just struck me that in order to make this function at all, you have to restrict the range of the instruments tremendously.
Yes, and I
You're
did.
stuck in the middle register there.
No, I actually stuck most of them into whichever register I thought they were most themselves. So where the trumpet is the most trumpety, I thought would be in its low register, where it has the most opportunity for partials to contribute to its timbral fingerprint, or at least spectral fingerprint. And
But if you wanted to deal with the instruments in a more flexible way, where instruments come in several registers, and we take note not only of a sort of castrated version of what the instrument is in a sort of abstract fashion, but you take note of the reality of the instrument as it moves through registers, it moves through dynamics, as it moves through configurational types and so on. How would you want to modify this initial concept?
I think it's a bit of a lose-lose situation. If I went about to make all these modifications, I think the system would have to be, that accommodated for those input, would have to be so complicated that any simple movement within the system wouldn't translate out to the output. So by ignoring all those extra parameters, I was hoping that I could create a simple space that felt relatively truthy, but it was simple enough that if I do a simple transposition there, it makes sense as a transposition, that it translates through to the end result. And I think if I had an nth dimensional system that accounted for all those things, I would potentially be serving the narrative goal better, but I'd be losing out on its function in the piece.
So I noticed that at the outset, you when you described large issues in the piece, metaphors in the piece, that you talked about a lot of things that you talked about, for example, the dissonance, the potential dissonance between structure and material, between sensation and some sort of other kinds of more skeletal, formal,
Deeper forms,
yeah. And you talk about a lot of things that involve vagueness. You even use the word vague deliberately in a lot of places. You talked about fuzzy frustrations. Things are vaguely different. At one point you asked, is this the prime version? Where is its identity? It comes from an uncertain place. And then, there were things about paradoxical relationships that may have cancellation tendencies and things like that. And then when you get into talking about the operations of the piece and the rule-based physical realities that govern, that have constraints and things like that, you talk very positively about things. Things do this, things have these properties. And what strikes me is that this relationship, this kind of, it struck me as noteworthy, that this pairing is not one that's about subjective versus objective, which is clearly, which you actually speak of in the more affirmative language. It's more about, to me, it's about like affirmation versus uncertainty, or in a sense, positive statements versus sometimes negative ones in a way, and or an absence of some sort of positive statement. And so that's just an observation. And I wanted to play as a backdrop for maybe you speculating with those qualities on where you're going, thinking about where you've been at Stanford and what comes next. What are the kinds of things that remain as viable and productive uncertainties and vagueness, and which are the things that you think are you imagine might have some excitement and promise for you about the more kinds of affirmative, positive sort of things, if that makes any sense.
Well, I think I like a good joke. And what I mean by that is that a good joke does what I talk about when I'm speaking to the sensuousness of surface having a dissonance against a deeper structure. The dissonance between the context of the language used in a joke and then the implications of those words and the shift that happens at the punchline is the sort of, not that I'm after humor in music necessarily.
But it's the incongruity thing.
That incongruity produces just an effervescence, a sparkliness, as I also mentioned, used the word before, and now cement it, sparkly. That's, so it's just like the grain of what's interesting about these contradictions and the paradoxes that are there is and that plays into my use of the word vague, because it doesn't have a clear solution, and indeed I don't intend to ever pose clear solutions. I'm most interested in finding questions that I think are interesting and maybe trying to exemplify them in a piece of art or a piece of music. It's not necessarily, I don't know what actually that last sentence, I don't know where, my brain just went off on a thing. But as for where I'm going, I think I'm very interested in finding different surfaces and treating them in this way. So, for instance, I really enjoyed another exercise I've done in my time here that was a plunderphonic exercise. It wasn't the particular cultural song item that I used, or that I chose to use, that was what was pleasurable about the experience, but taking the connotations of it and composing with them. And I think that's what I find very interesting about music in general, is that it's never ever boils down to the purely sensual. There's always some coloration of experience by memory or by expectation or by one's just sense of being in time that allows us to group certain things in certain ways and derive connotations and meaning from them. So it's those meanings that I like to play with, as opposed to the surfaces that get you there. But I think that the surfaces enable the connotations. Obviously, if I did all the same procedures here with entirely different material, it wouldn't have produced the same piece, first of all, but it wouldn't have maybe even had a very similar effect or affect. And certainly if I use something drastically different, or something, say, recorded media, and subjected it to the same sort of cutting up and morphing and parsing up, I think I still achieve a certain vagueness, which is kind of easy to do. I mean, you can either do it by incredible respect for your polls, or you can just be lazy. I hope I was the former, not the latter. But the vagueness means something different if the surface that is being treated vaguely is different. And all these connotations and meanings are where I find interest in composition.
So where does that leave you now with the subjective and the objective?
I think the subjective won.
I think the subjective one indeed, yes, but wherein resides the, if at all, the perceptual quality of the real?
You mean the real?
I mean, I know we're
perception
talking. Yeah, we're talking of metaphor, of course, the whole time. Yeah. But you and I had a sort of cultural revolution struggle over this business of the real and ontological reality and so on. But it doesn't matter now. I just want to know if there is, using these systems, working through the whole thing, there is some aspect of the real which provides a sort of rock the Titanic can sink against, or there's something in there which has not been erased by the local sort of polish.
Or the subjective erosion. Or
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of surface qualities of the material. Speaking again of surface, the different this motive that I showed tracing through the score is one that I did not change very much at all. In fact, it came up actually often enough in the course of me being subjective. It fell through the sieve that I was using so often that I gave it a sort of primacy and declared it sacred and left it. Similar to the second piano solo, which compared to the first piano solo, which is a lot more energetic and dense and figured than the second. Well, maybe not more figured. It's hard to say what makes something more figured. But it's, I think, an interesting point to make or thing to know that the second solo was almost, as it appears in the score, written by my computer and not by me at all. It followed my rules, and I appealed to certain things and was consistent in deriving those rules. But I think that's kind of a little interesting side note, because it's, of the two solos, it feels the most human, I think, the most expressive in a human way, which I think is a very subjective opinion of mine. So it's interesting to me that the most objective thing that made it through all the way also seems the most subjective. And that's a dissonance.
Which you did make the subjective decision to leave it as it was.
I did. And I should say that regardless of whether we disagree about fundamentals of reality, I'm just saying, if I didn't have that pole here, I'd be like without a paddle on some creek that was not water, and I wanted to avoid that. So I just, for the sake of argument, let's just say reality. And then let's say, okay, but what about subjective reality? And actually, it's the argument we had that's like the thing that I'm interested in going through the piece. But
Do we have any questions from our Japan-based faculty?
Yes, we do.
oh,
Yes, and this has to do with the overall form of the piece, which on some level is actually very powerful and I don't know, convincing. And I guess if you could tell us about how you came up with it, because it's actually pretty simple, but also surprising in some ways. So I'd like to hear about that.
okay. Well, just practically speaking, my original conception for the piece was one that was quite long, 30 minutes of the sort of meandering in and out of focus that happens between sections B and D of this version of the piece. And with the practical constraint that I couldn't write that much music, you can decide whether I mean that I couldn't or that I wasn't allowed, it's up to you. I decided I had a kind of a crisis where I wanted to still include that kind of activity, but I didn't have the space for it anymore. So I decided to open with something very strong and dense, and I thought, since the piano was the instrument I was most dreading writing for, because I don't like the idea of this pitch sieve, of forcing myself to equal temperament, and pitch is very important to me, that I would sort of treat it as the elephant in the room and tackle it head on. So after this, the idea occurred to me to open big and immediately drop down, not move down as in an unwinding, but just there's this thing and there's this other thing, and they relate in different ways, but they can be taken separately, at least in the mind. They can't, but you can perform the solo and then perform the thing. That's not what I mean. But the benefits of having this loud, large statement and then having the sort of indistinct repetition and reiteration that I was interested in as the benefit was that it made the latter more poignant. It gave it a little more power to have something to compare against, to have something that it's deriving its material from. And also sort of just on the sort of perceptual side, having something that unrelenting start and continue for a good 2 minutes, which is a short but not too short amount of time for something like that to happen, and then suddenly to drop off, leaves one with a vacuum. It creates a vacuum of expectation, of material, of interest, and I really liked the tension that came out of making that juxtaposition, that hard juxtaposition. It was just made the most sense in the world with regard to the metaphor of the mirror, which I had been working with all along. It's like, here's a line. There's the mirror right there in one way. And once that happened, the rest kind of fell into place. I wanted to maintain a certain expectation for the piano to come back in, but I wanted to delay that a certain amount. And I think if I were to rewrite the piece without durational restrictions, it would be to increase the duration of that central section and maybe give it a little more time to find its own shape. Right now I feel like I've forced it to do something that I don't entirely agree with, and that is it just sort of goes from here to here. That section of the piece, there is a sort of a fairly clear through line for me. But the through line does serve to establish the expectation for that piano re-entry at rehearsal D, and which I was sort of treating as a sort of a nesting of mirrors, like the final battle in Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee, where he's facing off against the bad guy, and he's in basically a circus house of mirrors, and he can't find out. He doesn't know which of the images of the bad guy he sees has the primacy of identity. Until he doesn't know who to attack, and he gets scratched, and it's a little tense. But I digress. The form kind of fell naturally, not in a pejorative sense, it fell naturally out of the need to have something juxtaposed with the sort of material I originally wanted, and then the implications of the sort of material that I came up with as a response to that need. Yeah?
He fell asleep.
Oh.
Anything
You had a
else?
question earlier, Jonathan. Did I answer it in the course?
Well, I only if there's time, we can do this offline. First of all, bravo. I'm interested in, I love your concept of pillaged and stolen and strict time. Given the context of this unrelenting beginning, unrelenting actually seems to conflict with the concept, with your marking of pillaged time. I mean, the nature of unrelenting in terms of energy is just what came off in the piano, which is not at all pillaged. So although I love the poetics of the markings, I don't think it worked. I didn't hear it at all.
Yeah.
I don't think it worked here.
Well, there's, in one category of the answer, I'm not 100% confident that this was the version, the realization of what I wrote, but I'm curious about how you then define pillaged. I mean, the unrelenting aspect I'm trying to characterize as that of energy, and this violence, this unrelenting violence, which I do strongly associate with pillaging and sacking and burning. And there's an order you should do those in if you want to extract information from the people, but what you said that you felt that they didn't work together.
Well, only because unrelenting is a stream of energy which can only really be realized the way it was, which is in very strict machine gun kind of rhythm.
I see. Yeah, no, on that level, there is definitely a contradiction. And perhaps the level I intended for it to coincide is a little more abstract than would be successfully contributing to a good performance. And that is totally worth considering.
I mean, I think that, yeah, it's a minor point.
Yeah,
but I
no,
think
but
that
it's
the
important.
distinction is maybe pillaging pulse versus pillaged time, which to me means something very, very different.
when we say the word time, then are you taking it to mean something more subjective? Because pulse seems to me something we can quantify or measure, but time is, I mean, we do measure it, but
Whatever you do to time, you're doing to the flow of time. So if you're robbing it in the traditional sense of rubato, you have to have time to bring that. You have to have space within the pulse to bring that off. And if you're pillaging time, it seems to me you have to have more space within the pulse to pull that off, rather than less.
no, and there was a high ceiling on that part of the material, where the tempo is set very high, and so it's very hard to do anything but skip material or speed up if you give too much time back, which is where I wanted to make the distinction between pillaging and robbing, because what kind of robber gives the stuff back at the end? It's silly. But
Yeah, if it's a moderate tempo, then you have room.
yes. No, it would be, I'm interested enough in this spectrum of time instructions to compose another piece that, it's also the nature of the material didn't really bear itself to being modified in that way. Like, how would you notice if it was that or not? Yeah, so something more trackable as a base would emphasize certainly that operation. Yeah, performance operation.
I'm afraid that for logistical reasons, I
That's
think
true.
we need to adjourn. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Michael and Barbara.